Hey everybody, it is a blessing to be back with you again, going through the 12, or the minor prophets. Tonight we're going to be looking at Habakkuk. And as always, we're going to start off asking some questions about the book, about the writer, about the time when he's alive, just by way of introduction so we kind of get a feel for what's going on in the book. So let's start off asking the question, who is Habakkuk? We don't know. And as with anything regarding the Bible that we don't know, that means that there are all kinds of traditions and legends and stories surrounding the prophet. Even when you get into some of the additions to the Old Testament that are present in the Septuagint, the Greek copy of the Old Testament, you have stories about Habakkuk flying through the air, being drugged by his hair, to feed the prophet Daniel while he is in the lion's den. So surrounding the prophet, because we know very little, there are a lot of legends and traditions. The same thing with Jesus. We have very little information about the life of Jesus when he is a small child. So there are legends and stories galore about what Jesus was like as a child. We don't know what Jesus looked like. So people will go through history and fabricate documents giving descriptions of Jesus because we just don't like to know stuff. Or we don't like it when we don't know things. So we make information up. Habakkuk, we know nothing about him. He's the prophet Habakkuk. He wrote this prophecy, or he saw this vision around the time, truly around the time of Daniel, late 7th century, 610 or later, 612 or later probably. So that's kind of who he is. When is he writing? We already mentioned it briefly, 612 or shortly after. Now, why do we say that? The reason why we say that is because if you remember when all of these prophets are taking place, we've kind of talked about it already, it's during the reign of Josiah. So from about 640 and on down through his death in 609, that's when these prophets are writing. Habakkuk is in there somewhere. In 612, Nineveh falls. Babylon rises up after the death of Ashurbanipal in 626, 627 BC. You have Nabopolassar, Nebuchadnezzar's father. He will come and begin fighting, and the battle goes badly. The war goes poorly for Assyria, and in 612, Nineveh falls. That's where you have Pharaoh Necho coming up from Egypt. He's going to go join the Assyrians in battle. Josiah goes out, fights with him, and gets killed. That happens in 609. So Habakkuk is probably writing somewhere between the fall of Nineveh, 612 BC, and the Battle of Carchemish, where the Assyrians are ultimately defeated, which is in 605 BC. So he's probably writing somewhere in there. A good guess would be around 609, when the good King Josiah, who, if you're a Hebrew, has done all of these amazing things, right? He's restored the temple, he's putting all of the laws back into practice, he's had the book of the law is found, he implements it. It seems like a really great thing, but then he dies in all of the political turmoil. So maybe around then, that may be one of the reasons why this book is written, asking the question, how come the righteous are swept away with the wicked in judgment? That is when he is writing. That also kind of gets to the why. The political upheaval, I mean, we might have a feeling for what that's like in 2020, being in the middle of an election year, and then in even a contested election where there's going to be all sorts of lawsuits and you just don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. That's what it was like for the people at this time, where nobody knows who's going to be in power tomorrow. It was Assyria, and they seemed indestructible, and now they're destroyed, but now Egypt is coming to help, and Josiah's dead, and who knows what's going to happen. It could be in a time like that where people look around and they think this is just chaos. We have no idea what's going on. We have no idea what is going to happen, and we don't know where to turn. God, where are you? We cry out to you, but where are you? Why don't you answer? That might be the scenario, right? The circumstances under which a book like Habakkuk could be written. Now, ultimately, the answer that the people are going to get, or that Habakkuk is going to get to deliver to the people, is not going to be a pleasant answer. He's basically going to say, you're just like everybody else. Judgment is coming. That's why things are crazy. And that actually might be applicable to us today as we get into the text in just a minute. So what are some notable details about the book? There are only 4 or 5 prophecies, and that count differs depending on what you do with chapter 2 and verse 14. There are 4 or 5 different prophecies, but they make up 41% of the book. So it is very much a prophetic book. Almost half of the material is looking forward to events that are coming. But there are 4 distinct prophecies that we can see in the text. One is the expansion of Babylon, which happens in chapter 1. Babylon's going to go up and just continue growing into this just juggernaut of destruction. The fall of Jerusalem, which is mentioned in chapter 1 verse 12, and in chapter 3 verse 16 specifically, you see Jerusalem falling. The fall of Babylon, so the destroyer is going to be destroyed, is a theme throughout the biblical text. When God raises up a nation to bring it in judgment against a people, very shortly thereafter that nation often falls into judgment itself. Even Israel, who is the judger, the nation raised up against the Canaanites. So even Israel. So if your nation is being raised up as a destroying nation, it's not going to turn out well for you historically. So the fall of Babylon, then maybe in chapter 2 and verse 14, a look at the new heavens and the new earth that Isaiah will talk about and many of the other prophets will hint at, where the glory of the Lord covers the face of the earth. Maybe that could be a hint at that in chapter 2 and verse 14. And then in chapter 13, Satan being destroyed. Actually, God using the machinations of Satan to destroy him. And so that's really powerful. When we get there, we're definitely going to be skipping forward and looking at the cross. And that's kind of the book. Those are the notable things about the book. So let's get into chapter 1 and start talking about the text. When we get into chapter 1, what we're going to see is this question, where are you? Where is God? Right, so if you got your Bible with you, open it up to Habakkuk chapter 1. And verse 1 just gives you, here's Habakkuk, he saw this vision. And it starts in verse 2. O Lord, how long shall I cry for help and you will not hear? Or cry out to you violence and you will not save? In other words, I'm pouring my heart out to you and it just doesn't seem like you're answering. Where are you and why aren't you doing what I want you to do? Right? That's often really what we mean when we say things like this, is we have to be careful that we don't mistake our expressed need with the need that we're actually feeling. Habakkuk really doesn't think that God can't hear. How come you're not hearing? Why aren't you saving? Habakkuk doesn't think that God won't save. It's that God isn't acting the way that Habakkuk wants him to, or the way that the people want him to. He isn't stopping the Babylonians. He isn't making the situation comfortable. He isn't giving them back the prosperity and peace that they had known under Josiah for so long. Why aren't you doing what we want you to do, God? And often when we cry out in frustration, it's the very same thing, isn't it? If we're sick and we don't want to be, and we cry out to God, why are you doing this? It's because he's not doing what we want. And one of the things that Habakkuk is going to answer, especially, we might feel this in this tumultuous time where we don't know what's going to happen with the virus. We don't know what's going to happen with employment. We don't know what's going to happen with the country. Is it going to be shut down? Will it be open? We don't even know who's been elected president after the election day. What's going on? And we might cry out to God in this very same way. What are you doing? And the problem isn't really that we think God can't hear or that God doesn't care. The problem is that God isn't doing what we want. And really, that is Habakkuk's complaint. When he says, where are you, God? He's really not asking God, where are you? He knows. The complaint is, God, why aren't you doing what I want? And so that's what we're seeing here. Habakkuk looks around him. He sees violence everywhere. In fact, some of the words here are going to call back to Genesis chapter 6, where the earth is just filled with evil continually. Same kind of concept here. Habakkuk is going to make several references all the way back to Genesis when things are bad, when sin is infecting and ruining the world. Habakkuk looks at that. That's the question. Where are you? I see all of these things that are bad, but I don't see you acting. I don't see you doing anything. So that's going to get us back to our text then in Habakkuk chapter 1. Why do you make me see iniquity, and why do you look idly at wrong? Right? Why do you make me see iniquity, and why do you look idly at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me. Strife and contention arise. And actually what we're seeing here in the Septuagint, which is the Greek copy, which the New Testament writers quote from when they quote Habakkuk, is actually, he talks about judgment. Habakkuk is going to say, judgment has come against me, but the judge is receiving, right? The judge is taking a bribe. And so what we see is the law that was put in place and implemented again by Josiah, the law is only as good as the people administrating it. And when he looks around, he sees not only all the tumult and chaos in the nations, around about him, but he sees the same thing in his own people, even though they have the law. Why aren't things going the way they ought to be? We have the law, we have all these things. Well, the law is only as good as the people who administer it. And that is one of the reasons why the law can't save. Right? And this is going to become an important discussion that Habakkuk is brought into in the New Testament. Why isn't salvation through the law? Well, the law is only as good as the people who administer it. The law is pure and righteous and holy and good. It is from the Lord. Everything in it is right. But it is only as good. It is only as powerful. Maybe that's the better word. It is only as powerful as the people who administer it. And it is not being administered, so the law is powerless. And in verse 4, that's what you see. So the law is paralyzed, and justice never goes forth. The wicked surround the righteous, and justice is perverted. Why is it perverted? Because the judges are wicked. They're taking bribes. And since they're taking bribes, the good things in the law don't happen. And that, unfortunately, is the reality of the world that we live in. It doesn't matter how good a system you have in place. If the people running the system are corrupt, then no matter how good your rules are, corruption will be the end result. And so that's what we're seeing here. That is why he is crying out. He's crying out against the corruption in Judah. He looks and he sees the tumult in the world around him. He's like, God, where are you? Why is this happening? How come you're not making things turn out the way that I want them to? And that's a powerful question. Often when people say, why would God do this? What they mean is, I don't like that. How come God did it? And ultimately, the answer that Habakkuk is going to get here in the rest of chapter 1, he's never going to get an answer to his question. It's like Job, who continually throughout the book is going to say, if God would show up and just go to court with me, I could show him why he's wrong. And God never answers Job. He doesn't even consider Job's questions. And here, when God comes and answers Habakkuk in the rest of chapter 1, Habakkuk, or here in the section in chapter 1, verses 5 through 11, God doesn't even entertain Habakkuk's question, really. He doesn't say, oh, Habakkuk, here's the answer to all of your questions. He sends his answer, as a matter of fact, to all the people of Judah, not just to Habakkuk. Habakkuk is expecting deliverance, looking out, look at all these bad things that are happening, Lord, please make it right. And God actually tells Habakkuk that judgment is coming. I'm not going to redeem you. This is all part of the plan to judge you, is the response. Probably not what he was hoping for, but that's the response that he gets. So let's look in verse 5, and this is what Habakkuk is saying. Look when the nations in sea wonder and be astounded. I'm doing a work in your days that you would not believe if you were told. In other words, I'm about to do something amazing and you won't believe it. Incidentally, this is quoted by the Apostle Paul over in Acts chapter 13, when Paul is talking to the Jews about the salvation that is coming, and he warns them, be careful that what is written in the prophets doesn't happen to you. This new thing that God is doing in Jesus, you don't believe it, even though I'm telling you. But if you reject this, the end, just like here in Habakkuk, the end is going to be the destruction of Jerusalem. The end for the Hebrew people, when they reject Jesus as Messiah, is going to be the destruction of Jerusalem. And just like God raised up the Babylonian army and brought in just this cataclysmic destruction in 586 BC, the same thing will happen, except in 70 AD, it's Rome. God is going to raise up a destroyer and bring them in, and judgment will fall upon the people, and it will be unbelievably bad. Then not long afterward, the destroyer will be destroyed. And so again, it's this pattern that we see in the biblical narrative. And ultimately, when we think about sin and the effects of sin and how death comes in, and death is the power that Satan has over all mankind, right? There's a very real sense in which in that scenario, Satan is the destroyer. And on the last day, sin and death and Satan will be thrown into the lake of fire, and the destroyer is destroyed, right? And we're redeemed, right? So that's kind of the backdrop for this prophet, and that's where we're headed. And that's why it's significant, because even in the face of this terrible judgment that is coming, there is going to be this glimmer of hope. Yes, Babylon is coming. Yes, the Chaldeans are destructive. Yes, they're going to sweep you away and carry you off into captivity. But in the end, the destroyer will be destroyed. And when that happens, the Lord's people will be redeemed, and they will be brought back from their captivity. And so ultimately, when you take a step back and you look at the big picture here, yeah, we are held captive in bondage by sin, but that destroyer will be destroyed, and we will be set free in Christ, and we will be redeemed. Right? And so that's where we're headed with the prophet. So here, I'm doing this thing, and you don't believe it, but it's coming, whether you want it to or not. Then in chapter 1, verses 6 through 10, the Chaldeans are coming in judgment against the land. Behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, a bitter and hasty nation. Right? They're wrathful. And when we think about conflict, you don't win war by being the nicer nation. Right? You don't win by being more gentlemanly than the people that you are fighting. I remember I had a friend we were talking with a veteran from World War II, and they were talking about how bad the people that we were fighting were. And the response from that soldier was, "We won." What do you mean? Well, you think about how brutal you think that they were, but we won. And that was a very sobering thought. When you think about how bad the Assyrians are, we won't get into the graphic descriptions of what they've done, but they are ruthless. For the Babylonians to be able to defeat them, they have to be worse. And I don't mean worse qualitatively. I mean even more ruthless. They have to be even more brutal, even more aggressive, even more destructive in order to defeat the Assyrians. And so when you think about just this juggernaut of Assyria that conquered the entire region seemingly without effort, and the Babylonians are coming through, that must be even more terrifying. I'm raising them up, and you're not even going to believe what I'm doing. The fact that I'm using all of this chaos, these foreign nations, to bring judgment against the Lord's people, you don't believe that this is what is happening, but it is. And what we see here is the Chaldeans are coming, and God is going to use the darkness to judge the darkness. Judah has become corrupt, and God is going to use a corrupt nation to judge a corrupt people. And the issue here is that the people in Judah think that they aren't corrupt. They think that they are righteous, that they are faithful, and that they are doing everything that God wants them to do. The same thing, where God uses darkness to judge darkness, the same thing happens on the cross, where Satan is coming, and Satan does this terrible thing in killing Jesus on the cross. But God uses that darkness. He uses the execution of Jesus on the cross to execute vengeance against Satan himself. And so this is something that only God can do, and it's one of those reasons why the prophet will says, you don't believe it, even though I'm telling you, is because it doesn't even enter into our mind to work that way. That God would use the Babylonians to bring judgment on the people of Judah is just outside of the realm of possibility as far as they're concerned. And then we look at Jesus and the cross. The fact that God would use the death of his son, the death of the Messiah, to bring about the redemption of people, it is outside of the realm of possibility in the mind of Satan. And so God uses the darkness to defeat the darkness. And that's going to bring us full circle in just a moment in Habakkuk chapter 3, where we see Satan being pierced upon his own spears. But that's what's happening. And so these people that God is bringing in judgment, he's judging darkness with darkness. Josiah is not going to heed the advice, and he's going to go out and fight with Necho, and he will be killed. Zedekiah is not going to listen to the Lord, and he is going to ultimately be destroyed. And so here, this nation who is going to seize dwellings that are not their own. Now, this is the promise that is given to Israel as they are going into the promised land. You will live in houses that aren't yours. You will reap what you have not sown. Now the Chaldeans are doing it. It's a reversal of the blessings. Those blessings are now becoming a curse to the people of Israel, to Judah. And those outsiders are coming, and now they are the ones cleansing the land, just like Israel came in and cleansed the land of the Canaanites and all of their wickedness. Now Babylon is coming and sweeping through and cleansing the land of all the wickedness of Israel and Judah. And so it is just a reversal of fortunes. And if you're an Israelite, it stings a little bit, because basically now you're Canaan. And that, unfortunately, is what you see throughout the story of the Old Testament, is that Israel slowly, maybe not slowly at all, actually, that Israel becomes Canaan. They become all of the other nations around them. And so like they were thrown out of the land, now it's happening to Israel too. Now this force that is coming is dreadful. And that's this question. Why are you going to use the unholy to judge the holy? It is God's answer in verses 6 through 11 that he is coming and he is bringing destruction. Well, this troubles Habakkuk because Habakkuk doesn't like the idea that the unholy are going to be used to judge the holy. So let's get over to verse 12 in chapter 1. And here's what the Masoretic text says. Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One, we shall not die. O Lord, you have ordained judgment. You have ordained them as judgment. You are the rock and you've established them. And then in verse 13, it seems to be talking about God. You who are purer of eyes than to see evil, you cannot look at wrong. Now, the interesting thing is that when you turn over and you look at the Septuagint, right, there are some pretty significant differences between the Masoretic text and the Septuagint here. The Septuagint actually looks at it from just anybody, right? Holy eyes cannot look upon certain things. Holy eyes cannot look upon wickedness. And the idea here is that they can't do wickedness with delight. But you're using people who look upon wickedness with delight. Right? And when we think about God and the instruments that serve God become holy, the trouble that Habakkuk seems to have is he says, yes, I understand. You have established them, right? We have that right here. You have established them, those Chaldeans, for judgment, for reproof. But how? Why? Will you allow them to swallow up people that are more righteous than them? And here is where there is some bitter truth. Habakkuk views God. Again, in the Septuagint, it almost says, turning a blind eye. Habakkuk views God, or maybe the people of Judah, view God as turning a blind eye to their situation. And in the raising up of the Babylonians and this coming destruction, they say, how can you allow this to happen? Because those wicked people are coming to hurt us, your people, and we are the holy ones. And the bitter truth is that God isn't turning a blind eye at all. The Israelites are not holy. They are not who they think they are. And that is one of the sad things on the Day of Judgment, or 586, 70 AD, any day there's a Day of Judgment regarding the people of God, is there is this sense in which they are surprised. They don't realize that they weren't the people of God. And this is the danger of things like syncretism. And we talked about that last time, where you begin combining things together. When you combine your culture and Christianity, and you see those things as inseparably linked together, you have begun to enter into what is called syncretism, where you combine two competing ideas together. We don't worship the nation, we worship the Lord. We don't worship our situation in life, our culture, anything other than God. And the moment we start pulling those things together, what you have is what Habakkuk is going to say a couple times, and what several of the other prophets are going to say is that things like wine are mockers. Wealth is deceitful. It lies to you because you think everything is fine when it's not. And so that is where this question comes from. How can you use the unholy to judge the righteous? And the answer is from the Lord, you're not righteous. That's the problem. You aren't who you think you are. Now there will be righteous people in Judah, people like Daniel, who in 605, when Babylon is done dealing with Assyria and Egypt and has just conquered everything, in 605 Daniel is probably carried off in captivity to Babylon. So the Lord does preserve a remnant of people. He keeps those who are his. And this remnant will one day return. But the destruction upon the nation and the culture and the articles, the temple, the property, all of those things, that will be destroyed. Because judgment is coming. They're not holy. They have perverted everything. And God is going to cleanse it. Interestingly, in the Septuagint, in verse 11 of chapter 1, it talks about the Spirit making atonement. And so God is coming to cleanse the land. He is coming to clean the land and prepare it for the one who is coming. Remember, we talked about how justice is perverted and the law is only as good as the people who are administering it. Well, if you remember, or if you're not familiar, when John the Baptist comes, the forerunner to Jesus, he is sent to make straight the way of the Lord. So he is preparing things for the Christ. In other words, he is taking care of the crookedness that sin brings into the situation, and he is setting everything right. He's setting everything straight so that when Jesus comes, he's recognizable for who he is, and people can see him fulfilling the prophecies, and they can understand what the Lord is doing in their midst. And so here, this question, why are you doing this? It's because the people are unholy, and God is working, again, through love. And we don't often come to these judgment passages and say, oh, yeah, this is God being loving. Really, it is. He is removing wickedness so that there is a place for holiness. Those two things can't exist together. I mean, Habakkuk is kind of right in his question. Wait a minute, I thought you were holy. God is holy. So he is removing the wicked people so that there is a place for the holy people to be. He is making room for the remnant that is going to come. So why use the unholy? Well, the people aren't holy. That's the issue. Habakkuk, however, when we get now here to the end of chapter 1, to the beginning of chapter 2, and we can't go into all of the details in depth. So there's going to be some things that we skip, unfortunately. We're not going to get into detail with the destructive nature and the power of the Babylonians. You can see that in verses 14 through 17 in chapter 1. They're just absolutely destructive. Habakkuk will use the image of a dragnet, how it is thrown out and it just drags in all sorts of creatures. That image is used by Jesus in Matthew chapter 13 to talk about the kingdom of God, how it is like one who goes and casts out a dragnet, and he hauls in everything. This is God's judgment. It doesn't miss anybody. It is coming, and it will be complete. When the Lord brings judgment upon a nation or upon a people, it is complete. And the nation of Israel would be destroyed, except God is faithful. That's Malachi chapter 3 and verse 6. I, the Lord your God, do not change. Therefore, you, O sons of Jacob, are not destroyed. It is God's promises and God's grace that keep Israel from being destroyed, because truly there is none righteous, no, not one. There is nobody who could stand up before the Babylonians and say, well, you can't hurt me. I have only done what is good. Not even Daniel. Right? There is nobody who can stand up and say, I don't deserve judgment. Because truly there is none who is righteous. So the fact that there is a remnant that the Lord saves is evidence of God's grace and God's mercy, and that is kind of the underpinning of our hope. It's not the law. It's not our ability to keep it and do everything well. That leads to destruction. Our hope is in this God who delivers and this God who saves. And so Habakkuk, after he asks this question, God, how can you do these things? Well, we might think, oh, well, that's a little haughty, but Habakkuk is just trying to work through what is going on. And he says in chapter 2 and verse 1, I will take my stand at my watchpost and station myself on the tower. Or the prophets are the watchmen of Israel. And their duty is to look and see what the Lord says and then tell the people. That's what Habakkuk does. I'm going to sit on the tower. I'm going to wait for your reply. I'm going to look for what you will say. And then I will answer. Right? I will take that answer and I will give it to the people. Habakkuk is saying, we're working through this. I don't understand. Help me to understand. And then I will tell people whatever it is that you say. And that is exactly what Habakkuk is going to do. So the rest of chapter 2, verses 2 down through 20, are going to be God's reply. So chapter 2 is a long reply to Habakkuk's question. Why are you doing this? Why are you sweeping away the righteous with the unrighteous? Here's God's answer. In Habakkuk chapter 2, you get what is perhaps the most famous portion of the prophet's writings. And that is in Habakkuk chapter 2, in verse 4. Behold, his soul is puffed up. It is not upright within him, but the righteous will live by his faith. Right? So this vision is coming. The vision of judgment is coming. If you look in verse 3, the vision awaits its appointed time. God has told Habakkuk the Chaldeans are coming in judgment. They're absolutely coming in judgment. It is coming. It is hastening to the end. I'm not lying. Right? And this is very familiar, very similar to language that you will see in the New Testament, where people want to know, when are the things coming that you're talking about? When is this destruction coming that you're talking about? And the answer is, it's coming in its time. Right, 2 Peter chapter 3, do not count the Lord's patience as slowness. Right? It's not that he's not going to keep his word. He's being patient. And so this is coming. And the message is that the righteous are going to live by faith. There will be people who are saved. Habakkuk is concerned. Why are you sweeping away the righteous with the unrighteous? And the answer is God isn't going to. The righteous will be preserved, but they're not going to be preserved in the way that you might expect, by keeping the law, by keeping the ordinances, by offering the sacrifices, by doing all of the things that make a Jew a Jew. That's not what is going to save them. What is going to save them is their faith. The righteous shall live by his faith. And this theme is picked up by the New Testament writers. It becomes a central idea in Christianity of being justified through faith. The Apostle Paul is going to pick it up. Let's look over in Romans chapter 1 and verse 17. Now in this, the context for this is Paul has just talked about the gospel. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It's the power of God to salvation to everyone who believes. And the idea here is not that there's this body of knowledge, and once you know it all, now you can be saved. I mean, there are things that we need to know, but the idea here is that God is mighty to save. That is the good news. God, the power of God, God's might is what delivers. That is the good news. And it is for everyone, Jew or Greek, which means it can't be according to the law. right? The Jew first and also the Greek. Well, the law is not for the Greeks. The law is for the Hebrews. So in this good news that we've got, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. So like Paul said earlier in verse 4 and 5 of chapter 1, the prophets bear witness to this gospel. And their witness is that the righteous will live by faith. And so Paul is contrasting here legalism with being justified through faith. And the idea here is that it isn't what you have done, it is in whom you have trusted. In whom do you put your reliance? Do you rely upon armies? Do you rely upon your own righteousness? Do you rely upon legal rules? Is that where your hope is? Or is your hope in this God who delivers? This theme is going to be carried through again in Galatians chapter 3. Paul likes to use it this way. It is evident that no one is justified before God by the law, for the righteous shall live by faith. But the law is not by faith, rather the one who does them shall live by them. And so the argument being made here is that if salvation is predicated upon your ability to keep the rules, then you're lost. If, however, salvation is predicated upon the mercy and grace of God, then we have hope. And that is what Habakkuk really is saying, or the answer that God is giving to Habakkuk is that you're not righteous. I'm going to save you, though, if you are faithful. But there are those who will shrink back and they will be destroyed, right? And that is Hebrews chapter 10. We're going to see the same thing. My righteous one shall live by faith, right? Here is the again, there is a judgment coming. Don't think it's not. But the righteous will be saved. They will be saved through their faith. But the one who falls back, the Lord's soul has no pleasure in him. We, however, are not those who fall back and are destroyed, but we maintain our faith and we are delivered. The overtone here is that the Hebrew people, right, the nation of Israel in the first century is going to be judged. It's that Roman judgment coming in 70 AD. But these Hebrews who have their faith in Christ, they are not trusting in their heritage. They're not trusting in their law. They're not trusting in their traditions. They're trusting in Jesus. They're following Jesus. They will be delivered. They are the remnant, right? Christians are the remnant pulled out of the nation of Israel. Whether Jew or Greek, we are the remnant people, and we will be delivered because we have faith. We trust, and whatever God says is what we will do. When the prophet Jeremiah is talking to King Zedekiah, he says, surrender. Stop fighting. Go out and you will be delivered. That's counterintuitive beyond imagination. You don't walk out to your enemy and expect to be saved, but that is what God said. And so the idea here is that the one who listens and the one who does what God says is the one who will be saved. And this is what Paul says. I mean, sometimes when Paul writes, it might seem like he's overstating the case, or it might seem like he's saying, well, all you have to do is believe. But look at how he uses the language when he talks about faith. We have received grace and apostleship, right? His role in bringing about the gospel, to bring about the obedience of faith. That's critical right there, the obedience of faith. The one who has faith, the righteous shall live by faith. It is the one who does what God says. Not perfectly, right? Because that would be the law keeping. But it is the one who just comes to the Lord, like Habakkuk, sitting on his watchtower, saying, God, you tell me and I'll deliver the message. That's what it means to have faith. That's what it means to trust. God, you tell me and I'll do whatever you say. That is what it means to have biblical faith. I will hear what you say, God. I will do what you say, and I will trust that even if I don't understand what you're doing, that what you're doing is correct. So that gets us back to Habakkuk chapter 2, and here we see more from the Lord's reply. The righteous will live by faith, and those who are feasting will soon be brought low. Here again, this idea, wine is a traitor. Your translation may say something about wealth. In fact, there's a footnote here in the English Standard Version, and it says that the Dead Sea Scrolls actually indicate wealth. Wealth is a traitor. In the New Testament, Jesus tells the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. The rich man should have wound up in heaven, but he doesn't. It's this huge reversal of fortune where the poor person who people thought, oh, well, God doesn't really care about him, he winds up with Abraham. The rich man winds up in torment. Here, wine, wealth, is a mocker. And the arrogant, whose greed is as wide as Sheol, they will be collected into death. Right? They will be collected like they have been collecting. Now, this refers to all who are not just, right? Who act upon injustice. All who are not kind and loving and merciful, whether it's the Chaldeans or whether it's the Hebrews or whether it's us. Where our wealth lies to us sometimes. We think that everything is okay. It is okay if you're living faithfully. That's the litmus test, not these other things. However, we want it to be those other things because we like what our stuff tells us. And that's why this is a shock. That's why these people aren't going to believe what God is doing in their midst, because things have been so well for so long, and now all of a sudden they're not anymore. And God's saying, well, your prosperity has been lying to you. You have not been okay for quite some time. It's just now becoming apparent to you. Now, in this judgment, the glimmer of hope that is given in the Lord's response is 5 woes coming upon the Chaldeans. Yes, God understands that Babylon is not perfect. God understands that the Babylonians are wicked. Don't worry, they're going to be judged too. He's using them because the Lord raises up and tears down as he pleases. He is sovereign. He can do whatever he wants. But these people who are coming, they're going to be judged too. And in the rest of chapter 2, there are 5 woes. The first is in verses 6 through 8, and the plunderer is going to be plundered. Right? The Babylonians are coming through, and they're taking whatever they want. And they're reaping what they haven't sown. They're living where they haven't built. They're just doing whatever they want. And God says, this action is not just. They're coming through and they're behaving wickedly. They are going to receive recompense upon themselves. The plunderer will be plundered. The destroyer gets destroyed. That is a theme. That's important because humanity, has been plundered by Satan. Right? Sin has come in. Death reigns over us. But that destroyer will be destroyed. We will have victory over death because God redeems his people and destroys the destroyer. Death is the destroyer, and God is going to redeem us, and that the death, sin, and Satan, all of that thrown into the lake of fire, thrown into the hell of fire, we, the Lord's people, redeemed. So that's this woe. The first woe, verses 6 through 8, the plunderer will be plundered. Verse 9 through 11, woe to those who think they are secure. Right, here's this picture of being built up, of being untouchable, of thinking that their wealth kind of shields them. And the idea is that the Babylonians probably felt like they were untouchable. Right? They have just conquered the world, and there's nobody who can stand up against them. And the response is, be careful, because that pride will be humbled. And if you look in verses 9 through 11, the pride of the Babylonians will be humbled. Let's pull that up real quick. Woe to him who gets evil gain for his house and sets his nest on high to be safe from the reach of harm, right? That's the idea. God is going to call them to account. This should give us pause because Habakkuk, really all of the 12, make the actions of God real today. When we see God doing these things, using nations and then coming in judgment upon the nations for things like pride, that should give us pause. Especially when we live in a time in a political culture where people are talking about how great the United States is and how we're being built up and how there's never been another nation like the United States. You know, there's a king who said something very much like that. Look at this wonderful kingdom that I have built. And then he turned into a beast for 7 years. He was humbled. There's this kingdom that king ruled over, which thought that it was untouchable. And it was humbled. And so what this does is it ought to give us pause and cause us to stop and realize that we have to be careful where we put our pride, where we put our hope. Because if our hope is not in God, if we're looking to other things to save us and redeem us, then we will be put to shame. Just like the Babylonians are put to shame, because they thought they were secure, when really the only security is being in God's hands. Being truly the faithful people of the Lord. Woe to those, verses 12 through 13, woe to those who build in violence. They come and they use destruction, right? That's the opposite of what God intends for humanity. He intends for us to work together, to build up with one another, to lift up those who are low so that everybody can be together. That's the idea, right? That's what a community does. And we're not talking about perfect equality in every sense. That's not what we mean. But everybody being lifted up, having equal human dignity, having equal opportunity, being with each other, just like a family, right? People in a family are not entirely, completely, absolutely the same. Otherwise, you just have clones of the same person. But the idea here, the biblical image of humanity, is that we all work together, and we are all one people. And this is the opposite of that. And where that opposition to God's ideal exists, God brings judgment, because sin is falling short of God's glory. And so that's 12 through 13. Then there's that maybe, verse 14, the new heavens and the new earth. Let's look at that just briefly. We're not going to get too deep into that because it doesn't really seem to be the point. It just seems to be in case this is bringing you down too much, right? And so in verse 14, the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And this is judgment and redemption. This is looking back to the flood, where the flood covers the entire earth and sin is judged, but the righteous are delivered. And so here, the glory of the Lord, the knowledge of the Lord will fill the earth, like the sea, this water that comes in judgment and washes everything away. The waters of baptism, which kill you when you are baptized, right? You are baptized into death. You die in baptism, but then you are raised. We're raised with the power of the Lord and made a new person, right? And hopefully with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord, right? So that's kind of the idea, is there is this day of redemption coming that will be brought out of judgment. Israel will be brought back into the land, even though this judgment is coming now. Sin will be judged. And on that day when sin is ultimately and finally judged, there will be a people left who know the glory of the Lord, and it will fill the earth. Right? It's a beautiful picture, a moment where we get a glimpse into what is coming, despite the terrible things that are happening in the moment. That gets back then into the other judgments, 5 through 17. Woe to those who like Ham. Right? Genesis is thick here in Habakkuk. Woe to those who like Ham take advantage of people. When Noah was drunk in his tent and Ham goes and takes advantage of him, woe to people who do that. Woe to you if you are taking advantage of people who are in bad situations. God is going to judge that. Woe to you, verses 18 through 20, who put your trust in idols. All sorts of false religions, any false religion, whether it is wealth itself, mammon, whether it is actually some other idol that is worshipped, whether it is ourselves, whether it is anything other than the Lord, woe to those who put their trust in those things, verses 18 through 20. And then you get to verse 20. Let's look at that. Habakkuk chapter 2 and verse 20. The Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. I have seen this in multiple cry rooms. It's not a cry room verse. What this says is that despite all of the chaos, it is the Lord who sits as sovereign over everything. It is the Lord who is using the chaos to bring about his judgments. And the Lord being in his holy temple and the earth keeping silence before him is that all of the earth has been called into account. This is judgment. And everybody had better be quiet before their judge. It's like if you were a kid and you're ever in trouble, what do children do? Well, they put their hands together and they make themselves as small as possible and they stare at the ground. They don't talk. They don't do anything. Why? Because they're in trouble. That's verse 20. God is calling everything to account. This is not a nice cry room verse. This is a everybody is in trouble verse. However, the righteous will live by faith. And the knowledge of the glory of the Lord will cover the earth like the ocean. Right? So there is hope. Despite this cataclysmic, right, this just flood of judgment that is coming upon the people, there is hope. That's Habakkuk's song. Habakkuk chapter 3 gets us to this hope that is coming. He starts off by noting that God is merciful. And thank God he is merciful. Because if he was not, there is no hope. Nobody is good, none is righteous, no, not one. Those are true statements. I cannot stand before the Lord and say, I have done all things well. I can't. I can stand before the Lord and say, I have been faithful to you. I have striven to follow you, to listen to you, to do whatever you ask. I'm not perfect, but I am faithful. I want to be your child. I want you to be my father. And that is what God desires, a heart who says that. A heart that says those things. So here in Habakkuk chapter 3, this is what we see. O Lord, I have heard the report of you, of your work, O Lord, I do fear. In the midst of the years revive it. In the midst of the years make it known. In wrath remember mercy. And this is the important part of Habakkuk's song. He doesn't argue with God anymore. He's not asking any more questions. Lord, you said you're bringing them in judgment. You said that you're sweeping away everyone. Okay. Please be merciful. This is faith. That statement, in wrath remember mercy, that is faith. God, we deserve this. You're right. We deserve this judgment that is coming. Please be merciful. This is actually what you see with the king of Nineveh. When Jonah comes, yet 40 days and Nineveh will be overthrown. The king says, everybody put on sackcloth, everybody fast, everybody pray. Maybe the Lord will relent. He doesn't expect anything, right? This is how faith responds. When we come to the Lord, when we recognize that we are a sinful people and we come to the Lord and we beg for mercy, it's not with the expectation. This is the attitude of faith. Lord, in wrath be merciful. Lord, in your judgment, be merciful to me, a sinner. It is the tax collector beating his chest in the temple. Lord, be merciful to me, a sinner. That is biblical faith. There's no expectation. It is the recognition that we deserve judgment, but the exultation, right? The joy that we will see in this song when we know that the Lord is gracious and will deliver. Thank God that he is merciful in judgment. That's where our hope lies. So Habakkuk is going to continue with his song, and he recognizes at the beginning that God is merciful. He also recognizes that judgment is coming, and he's not going to argue with God about this anymore. In verses 3 through 7, God is bringing divine judgment with a destroyer, as seen throughout the Old Testament. He is going to scatter the mountains. He brings pestilence and plagues. He drives away the faithless before him. He comes in might, in powerful judgment. Not only is the Lord powerful to save, he is powerful to judge. And God is going to get glory. He will get glory through us, or like Pharaoh, he will get glory over us. He will get glory by delivering us, bringing us through the Red Sea, or he will get glory by closing us with the sea. Either way, God is going to get glory. We get to pick. Will we be faithful and live, or will we be faithless and God gets glory over us in judgment? When Jesus stands before the high priest and says, you will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of his glory, that's a threat. Right? I'm coming in judgment. You can be faithful, or you can be faithless and you will be judged. That is a massive overtone, right? That is a big thing that throughout permeates the New Testament text, is this judgment that is coming upon the faithless people. So another thing we see, judgment is coming. In verses 8 through 11, the creation properly fears the Lord. When you look at the song that is being sung here, verses 8 through 11, the mountains are going to writhe, right? They recognize that this Lord is coming, and they move out of the way. These unshakable mountains tremble in fear before him. The sun and the moon, they stand still in their place as they recognize that the glory of the Lord has come in judgment. And so the creation fears the Lord. The creation behaves the way that it ought to. Disaster is going to bring salvation. We see that in verses 12 through 15. So in chapter 3, verses 12 through 15, here's the Lord marching through the earth in fury, his judgment. He is threshing the nations in anger. Why? He goes out for the salvation of his people, for the salvation of the anointed. All of this, and this is the critical thing that we have to take away, all of this judgment is to bring about the Lord's salvation. God is not a toddler. He doesn't get angry and throw a temper tantrum and just go on this tirade of destruction to show everybody who he is. All of this is because God is merciful, even in wrath. And he has promised to bring deliverance. And God is making it possible for the deliverer to come. That is why this is happening. This is part of the biblical account of Christ coming into the world. God is making the way straight. And he will continue to do that until the day that Jesus arrives. And from that point forward, he will continue to make the way straight so that people can find their way to Jesus. That is who God is. A God of mercy, a God of salvation. Notice, this is judgment. Right? Israel is going to be destroyed. Judah is going to be destroyed. And he says, you went out for the salvation of your people. Not the judgment, for the salvation of your people. And then look at this. You crush the head of the house of the wicked. That's Genesis 3 language, right? Crushing the head of Satan. And here you've pierced him with his own arrows. The Septuagint actually says that you have pierced him with his own spears. So the idea here with that word, when you go over into the New Testament and Jesus is hanging on the cross and he is pierced with a spear, that picture is really powerful. That here Satan thinks he's winning. He's got Jesus on the cross. He has him crucified. He's dying. He's stabbed with the spear. Victory. that cross, actually, that spear, becomes the very thing that crushes the head of Satan. And so here Habakkuk is looking forward to the way that God's judgment, it seems, right? It would absolutely, if you were Hebrew, it would absolutely seem like darkness wins. The enemies of the Lord have triumphed over his people. But God says, no, actually, I'm bringing about the salvation of my people through this event. Maybe you can't see it, but that is precisely what I'm doing. And to the rest of the world, it seemed like the cross is kind of the end of Jesus. It is just the beginning. He will be raised from the dead. He will proclaim for 40 days everything in the scriptures about himself. He will ascend and sit at the right hand of heaven on high. The Spirit will be poured out on his disciples, and the world has not been the same since. Here is the Lord's victory. In the moment when it looks darkest, God uses that darkness to bring about glory. Only God can do that. That is why the Apostle Paul over in Romans chapter 11 will just laud and magnify God, who is able to do beyond what we can even imagine or understand. And the last thing that he's going to say, Habakkuk will say, is that I'm committed to the Lord. I'm committed, God, to do whatever it is that you tell me to do. And here we see in the end, the prophet's words are that God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer. He makes me tread on my high places. No longer is Habakkuk looking to his people. He's not looking to his culture. He's not looking to his own righteousness. Now, God the Lord is my strength. God is mighty to save. Not me. God is mighty to save. He is the one who makes my feet like the deer. He brings me the joy of salvation. He is the one who brings me to the places where I ought to be. All the blessings, everything, all the glory is the Lord's. And he is merciful to me, a sinner who he has redeemed through his Son, our Savior, the Lord Jesus. That's where Habakkuk is looking. That's where everything is headed, to that day in which we will be saved through the Anointed One. The Lord has been acting throughout time for the salvation of his anointed. Not only that the Christ, the Messiah who will come, God will redeem him from death, he will raise him from the dead, but then we, the Lord's people, the Lord's chosen, we will be saved through Jesus Christ. And that is the message of Habakkuk. In judgment there is hope. And in one day, ultimately, the destroyer, death, sin, Satan, they will be destroyed and we will be saved. I hope this has been a blessing for you. I hope this is encouraging. I hope it helps us to see how the 12 have meaning even today. And they are a powerful message of God's grace and goodness and love, even when those things are hard to see. God bless you, and we'll continue next week.